I watched her carefully fold the tickets and whispers into her bag. "Ready for a vacation?" She thought I wouldn't notice. She thought I'd be blind. But this time, karma wasn't late. It came with luggage, and it wasn't hers. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe and share if you love stories where betrayal meets sweet revenge. I still remember that morning like it was a quiet storm. The kind of storm you sense before it hits. Subtle, almost invisible, but heavy with tension. I was in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, pretending everything was normal, while every instinct in my body screamed that something wasn't right. Lucinda, my wife, moved through the apartment with a strange kind of precision that morning, folding clothes and slipping them into a bag as if rehearsing a role she'd been perfecting for months. Her hands trembled slightly, though she didn't notice, or maybe she did, and that was part of the thrill. I tried to speak casually, tossing a comment about the weather, about our weekend plans. Anything to break through the walls she had built around her. But she was distant, polite in a way that was almost sharp. There was a flicker in her eyes that made me pause, something secretive, something thrilling to her that I was meant to be blind to. And for a moment, I let the disbelief wash over me. I wanted it to be a misunderstanding, a fluke, a late surprise she was planning for me. But the messages I had glimpsed on her phone, the careful whispers she tried to hide when she thought I wasn't looking, they told a different story. I felt my chest tighten, the kind of tightening that comes from betrayal so close it almost burns your skin. But instead of rushing to confront her, I stood there, quiet, letting her movements etch themselves into my memory. Every folded shirt, every meticulously packed shoe, every glance at her phone made my mind race, imagining the world she was stepping into, a world she thought I'd never enter. She had rehearsed this moment for herself, not realizing that I had been paying attention in ways she could never suspect. I let the silence stretch, letting the tension build like a string pulled taut, knowing that my reaction would need to be measured. Anger flared beneath my calm exterior, a slow, simmering heat that I knew would boil over at the right moment. My mind began to map out every possible move, every angle of revenge, and every piece of poetic justice that could unfold. But before any of that could happen, I needed to see her fully, to witness the audacity of her choices, and to understand how far she was willing to go. And as I watched her, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was hurt, a deep, hollow ache that made the room feel smaller, tighter. There was disbelief, a refusal to accept that someone I had trusted with everything could act so casually while betraying me. And there was a flicker of something darker, a spark of patience, a quiet promise to myself that karma, when delivered right, is more powerful than any outburst, more satisfying than any moment of revenge you can imagine in haste. That morning, Lucinda packed for a vacation that wasn't meant for me. And in doing so, she wrote the first chapter of her own undoing. And I, Elias Thornfield, would be watching every detail, every step of her path, until the scales finally tipped. By mid-morning, the apartment had turned into a quiet battlefield. Lucinda moved with that same controlled grace, but now the signs were impossible to ignore. Every glance at her phone, every secretive smile, every pause as if listening to a private joke, it all hit me like punches I didn't want to acknowledge. The betrayal wasn't subtle anymore. It was right there, sitting between us like an invisible wall. I could feel pressing against my chest. I watched her pack the suitcase with a mix of disbelief and fury. Each item folded with precision, each gesture sharp and deliberate. She didn't even notice me standing in the corner, holding my coffee like a shield against the wave of emotions threatening to drown me. Her excitement was palpable, the kind that only comes when someone is about to step into a world where rules don't apply to them. A world she thought I'd never enter. And I realized, with a sinking certainty, that she was taking him with her. Not just figuratively, but in every detail. The flirty messages, the late-night calls, the hidden plans, all leading to this moment. I wanted to shout, to grab the suitcase and tear it open, to expose everything she was hiding. But I didn't. I couldn't. The shock had turned into a cold, calculated calm. My hands remained steady, my voice silent. Anger surged beneath the surface, coiling tight like a spring ready to snap, but I let it wait. There was something intoxicating about watching her carefully curate her own escape, knowing that every step she took was leading her exactly where I wanted her to go. And then it hit me, a strange sense of power amid the heartbreak. She believed she was clever, believing she had outmaneuvered me. But in reality, she had just set the stage for her own reckoning. Every laugh, every whisper, every stolen glance at her phone became a countdown to her undoing. I felt my pulse steady as I plotted quietly in my mind. I would not react with chaos or anger. I would respond with precision, with poetic justice. She had chosen to step into a world of lies. I would make sure she learned the cost of that choice without me ever raising my hand. Her suitcase zipped closed, and she paused to admire her work, a triumphant smile curling on her lips. She didn't see the subtle shift in my eyes, the quiet storm building behind them. I watched her leave the apartment, her steps light and unaware, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. Not a smile of relief, not yet, but a smile of certainty. Karma had already begun its slow, inevitable work. That morning, she walked out carrying her plans, her excitement, her secrets. And I, Elias Thornfield, stayed behind, holding the knowledge that the world she had built so carefully for herself was about to turn. And when it did, there would be no way for her to escape. Every betrayal has a price, and she had just written her own invoice. I sat at the kitchen table long after she left, the apartment echoing with the sound of the door closing like a verdict. The first rush of betrayal cooled into something clearer, a plan forming with the steady logic of a surgeon. I told myself I wouldn't be the man who screams and throws things. I would be smarter than that. I would let consequence do the work, and I would shape consequence until it fit the justice I wanted to see. Planning felt like reclaiming control, a way to stitch myself back together where she had torn me open. My mind cataloged everything I knew, destinations she mentioned in passing, snippets of conversations overheard, the timing of her messages. Each small detail became part of an invisible map. I began to think like a chess player, imagining moves and counter-moves, anticipating her smug confidence and how to dismantle it quietly. I would not expose her with a public spectacle. I envisioned something more intimate and precise, an unveiling that left no room for excuses. Every denial would be pointless, and every lie would land heavier than it had before. I started making calls with the same calm I used when booking appointments, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Voices on the phone became instruments in a quiet symphony, a voice to ask about dates, another to verify addresses, a careful message left for a brother who still answered when family mattered. I framed my words in casual tones, never revealing the edge beneath. Each contact was a soft nudge, like placing a chess piece in position without the opponent noticing the trap. I wanted the unraveling to look accidental to everyone but exact to me. There was a moral filter running under everything. I would not humiliate her with cruelty, nor harm anyone who didn't earn it. My aim was to reveal the truth, to hand it back to those who deserved to know. I imagined the moment she saw the faces she had tried to hide from, the hollow recognition, the sudden silence where laughter used to be. That image steadied me more than any burning desire for retaliation. It felt cleansed, righteous, in a way raw anger never did. At night, I wrote notes I never meant to send, small lists of facts, dates, messages, a ledger of proof. I organized screenshots as if preparing evidence for a quiet trial. Each entry was a tiny reclamation. I practiced my voice, rehearsed the calm with which I would explain things if asked. There is power in preparation. It makes truth inevitable and heavy in the right hands. When the time came, my actions would be like a simple, unavoidable fact landing on a polished surface. Clear, reflected, impossible to deny. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done without the cheap satisfaction of a dramatic scene from me. Letting family, those quiet judges of character, witness the truth would be more devastating than any public confrontation. I sipped cold coffee and listened to the refrigerator hum, content in the patient machine I had built, and waited patiently. She left with a lightness that made my teeth ache. The kind of buoyant confidence people show when they believe themselves invincible. I watched her go from the window, a suitcase in one hand, a laugh that sounded rehearsed, tugging at her lips. He waited in the car like an accomplice in a silent heist, and for a moment the city felt smaller, as if the world had narrowed to their footsteps fading down the street. I felt nothing like the man I'd been that morning. Anger had settled into an almost surgical calm. This was the moment I'd been shaping, the hinge I'd built for her choices to swing upon. The messages I had sent were the simplest kind of poison, casual, confident, impossible to trace. Enjoy the trip. Thought you'd like company, your family's arriving today. I didn't need to embellish. I watched as the seed did what seeds always do when planted in fertile ground. It grew. I imagined her smile draining first into confusion, then to a thin film of panic as the unexpected reality formed at the edges of her plans. That image felt like a blade, precise and clean. It happened faster than I let myself expect. A call from a distant cousin, a knock at the villa door. Small disturbances at first, then the kind of ripple that becomes a wave. Her face changed as if someone had switched the light in the room. The laughter died, sudden and ugly. And then the confrontation, voices bursting free like trapped air, sharp and accusing. I wasn't there to watch their mouths form the words, but I felt it in the shudder of the floorboards beneath my feet, in the messages that came through like shards of glass. She texted me once, then twice, a string of hurried, panicked lines that read like a confession in motion. I could almost hear the first shout across the room, the one that breaks polite facades into jagged pieces. How could you? It wasn't my voice, but it hit me the same. The family's questions came like a chorus, betrayal exposed in direct, unadorned sentences. There was no patience for excuses. I imagined the brother stepping forward, his jaw set, a slap of disbelief landing not on flesh but on reputation. The slap came metaphorically, but it echoed physically in my mind, a sound of consequences, connecting with the face of unapologetic deceit. She tried to speak, to weave the old stories into new lies, but the room had already decided. Eyes that once looked to her for warmth now scanned for truth, and nothing she offered fit. Shame is an animal that finds the softest place and claws until you feel hollow. I felt it for her, oddly a cold, clean pity that undercut the taste of triumph. I had wanted her to see the wreckage she'd made, not to revel in public humiliation. Still, watching the slow, inescapable collapse of her manufactured world was its own kind of quiet triumph. When the messages stopped, the silence that followed was heavy and final. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed, the air tasting like something washed. The twist had moved precisely, inexorably, from plan to reality, and the balance had shifted. Karma, I realized, didn't roar. It arrived as a series of small truths, each one unavoidable, until what remained was simply the honest shape of consequence. The apartment felt empty when she returned, though she didn't see it that way. She came back, carrying nothing but the weight of her own choices. And for a moment I almost felt sorry. Almost. Her confidence had been stripped bare, replaced by a jittery, fragile awareness that the world she had tried to manipulate had turned on her like a mirror. I watched from the corner, silent, letting her stumble through the realization that every step she had taken to hide. The truth had led her straight into exposure. Her first words were halting, hesitant, as if she were testing the air to see if I had changed, if I would rage or collapse or beg for explanation. But I said nothing, letting the silence do its work. Anger, confusion, regret, all of it was reflected back in her own eyes now. She didn't see the calculated calm behind my quiet breathing. She saw only the reflection of herself in a room that had become witness to her unraveling. The messages from that morning had already done their work. Family members had confronted her while she thought she was free, forcing truths into the open she had tried to keep buried. I could imagine every scene, the accusatory questions, the sudden stillness in the room as she realized no excuse could hold, the words stumbling over one another as she tried and failed to explain. It was a slow, deliberate unmasking, and she felt it in every fiber of her being. Karma had entered quietly, but it struck hard. Anger flared in her eyes as she turned to me as if somehow I was the villain, the one who had orchestrated her humiliation. But the truth was different. I hadn't orchestrated cruelty. I had allowed honesty to arrive at its natural destination. Every move I made, every message, Every quiet call had been carefully measured, not to punish her out of spite, but to let the world mirror back the consequences she had been blind to. Watching her flounder, realizing she had walked into the outcome of her own choices, was a satisfaction that felt deeper than rage or triumph. I could see her struggle to reclaim control, but the ground had shifted under her feet. The affair, the lies, the stolen confidence, all had been exposed to the people she thought she could deceive. Every attempt to rationalize or justify only deepened the crack in her composure. And as I sat there, calm, steady, I understood something vital. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a shadow stretching across a room, and leaves nothing but reflection in its wake. By the time she slumped into the sofa, exhausted, drained, and alone, I felt the tension lift from my own chest. The emotional storm that had churned inside me for weeks finally settled into a quiet clarity. She had been forced to confront her own reflection, stripped of pretense, and left with only truth. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply allowed the space to exist where karma had done its work, leaving her to sit in the wreckage of choices she had made, fully, undeniably, and irrevocably. And in that moment, a strange sense of peace filled me. A peace built not on malice, but on the undeniable certainty that some actions cannot escape consequence, no matter how carefully we try to hide them. I leaned back, letting the quiet of the apartment and the weight of her realization settle over us both. Knowing the scales had finally balanced, the house was quiet after the storm. Lucinda sat across from me, slumped and speechless, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like an invisible hand. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything had been said, not with words, but with the truth she could no longer avoid. For the first time in months, I felt calm, not satisfied in a shallow way, but whole in a quiet, enduring sense that the scales had finally shifted. She looked at me then, a mixture of fear, regret, and disbelief in her eyes. I recognized it instantly that moment when someone realizes they have been outmaneuvered, not by force, but by consequence. There is a strange beauty in that kind of karma. It doesn't yell, doesn't threaten, it simply arrives and leaves the offender to navigate the ruins of their own making. Her affair had crumbled, her vacation plans dismantled, her carefully constructed lies laid bare in front of family who mattered most. She had expected bliss and found a mirror. I thought about saying something, some final line to punctuate the moment, but I realized the weight of silence spoke louder than anything I could utter. Lucinda had seen her world collapse, and she knew, without needing to hear it from me, she had no one to blame but herself. There was no dramatic flourish needed, no shouting, no grand gestures. The slow, relentless inevitability of her own choices had delivered the verdict. I let myself take a deep breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. Months of sleepless nights, hidden doubts, and quiet anger had led to this simple, unshakable truth. Betrayal carries a cost, and patience is sometimes the sharpest weapon of all. Watching her realize that, fully and undeniably, was a justice far sweeter than anything I could have staged with my own hands. Karma had done the heavy lifting, and I was simply its witness. The apartment felt lighter, cleaner somehow, as if her absence of deceit had cleared the air. I thought about the future, about the quiet rebuilding of trust and self-respect, and about the knowledge that I had chosen my own path, untainted by rash revenge. I didn't need to humiliate her publicly. I didn't need her apologies. The lesson had been delivered perfectly, quietly, and irrevocably. I looked around, my gaze falling on the small details of our life that still held warmth. A photo I hadn't thrown away, a cup left on the counter, the morning light spilling across the floor. I realized that the real victory wasn't in her punishment, but in reclaiming my own peace. Betrayal had knocked me down, but I had risen steady and unshaken, letting the natural course of truth and consequence restore the balance. And as I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, I allowed a small, private smile to surface. Lucinda's choices had written her own ending, and I had simply witnessed it unfold. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't loud, it's dramatic or vengeful. It's quiet, inevitable, and perfectly aligned with the universe's own sense of justice. In the end, Karma didn't need my help. It just needed time. And that time had come.